Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. Of course, like, subscribe, and of course, comment as we bring you the best, most in-depth, insightful college football analysis, discussion, and debate that you are going to find online. We are headed back to the West Coast for Arizona football with Bryant Conger on the line from Wildcat Radio. Bryant, how you doing today?
I'm doing so good. It's starting to hurt, Mark. Thanks for having me on, and a big fan of your work and everything that you're doing on YouTube and through the podcast now, which is kind of cool. I like how you can listen to it via audio. So thanks for we use a lot of your stuff to do our previews of the Pac-12. So definitely appreciate your work.
I appreciate that feedback. And before we started to record here just a few seconds ago, Bryant popped onto the screen, and it's been so long. It's been a long time, but you certainly had some great content for us the first time or two around. So we appreciate you coming back on with us to break down the Wildcats here. Interesting football team that, of course, went to the Coliseum sometime in November last year with about 3 games to go with a shot at first place in the Pac-12 South Division. Things didn't go well there, although they certainly were in the game for 3+ quarters. And had a few close losses down the stretch to one Arizona State, of course, and then, of course, against Purdue, and 7-6. And now the keys are handed to Kevin Sumlin, and we know the quarterback is dynamic. So, Bryant, let's start there with Khalil Tate and Kevin Sumlin being a bit of a quarterback guru of sorts. Anything that we know in regards to what Sumlin sees in Tate? Of course, he sees the rare talent that we all see, but do we expect any coaching to be instilled here that may make a bit of a difference in developing Khalil Tate's game a little bit more?
Oh, absolutely. I think it starts with Kevin Sumlin, who did wonders with Johnny Football over at A&M, and of course, when he did his work at Houston. The one thing to mention is Noel Mazzoni, who's the offensive coordinator for Arizona. He is a quarterback whisperer. I mean, he's jumped all over the conference, which is pretty funny. But basically, everywhere he's gone, the quarterbacks that he's had that have had talent have really been able to grow under his leadership. So I think that's the biggest change in what we have with Khalil Tate. You know, Khalil Tate averaged 8.4 yards per carry anytime he ran the ball. Everybody knows him as a running quarterback, and he's one of the most explosive players in college football, period. And it's interesting because he's, I think, like 3rd or 4th when it comes to the Heisman Trophy predictions. With that said, he can throw the ball. And if you watch the Purdue-Arizona bowl game, even though Arizona lost that game, he was able to sling the ball down the field. And I think with a year under Noel Mazzoni, even for this year, but also in 2019, you're going to see a quarterback that will be one of the best in the country. And that's really exciting for an Arizona football fan.
Bryant, I got to tell you, I lost track of Noel Mazzoni. I remembered him signing with Arizona, but had forgotten that, even in addition to Kevin Sumlin having a good track record with quarterbacks, Noel Mazzoni certainly adds to that tutelage for one Khalil Tate. Pac-12 Media Days just concluded. Anything out of Kevin Sumlin's mouth or any of the players that is off the beaten path of the cliched, we're getting ready for the season one game at a time?
Not really. There's a couple players that are in our reserves that were announced weren't on the roster yet. There's a player, Scotty Young, is probably the biggest development coming out of the Pac-12 Media Day. So Scotty Young was likely could have been Arizona's 4th national freshman All-American. I think one thing that people forget is that Arizona had a very young defense that was not good, but there were really big bright spots on there. Colin Schooler, who showed up to the Pac-12 Media Day, had Tony Fields. Both of them were national consensus All-American freshmen. He had Kylan Wilborn. Scotty Young was another very promising player that got into some trouble in terms of the way he treated women. So and it puts Arizona in an interesting position just based on that. He has been given another chance and is tentatively on the depth chart. He would likely start in Arizona's secondary if he does get that chance again. I think there's some disciplinary issues, particularly now with the Me Too movement. So I think it'll be interesting to see how the coaches work through that, and Arizona fans should certainly keep an eye on it. With that said, he's a very talented player. There's a bubble screen that he blew up where he tackled 2 people. He tackled the guy that was screening for the ball carrier into the guy that carried the ball. They both fell down. It was probably one of the best highlights of Arizona's season last year. So he returns, which is a big boost for our secondary, which should be better. Arizona had the 117th worst defense in the country last year. We were very bad. We were bad at the run. We were bad at the pass. with that said, there were some players again that have the talent. So it'll be interesting to see if this new defensive staff you have we return our defensive coordinator, but he's moving and has kind of some more of the reins now, moving from the 3-3-5 to the 4-2-5. So I think the key to Arizona being able to be a contender in the Pac-12 is whether or not this defense can step up and get past the sub 100s to the 80s. And I think that's possible. And if that's the case, they certainly can challenge for the Pac-12 South.
Yeah, we've got our guy Ryan Mill on the line on the live chat here that gives you several bear downs to pass along. And also talking about the defense being extremely young with something like 8 freshmen.
It was last year, was
last season. Yeah,
last season. This season they'll be a little bit more seasoned, but last year the defense was quite young, and you could tell there were a lot of mistakes, but there was some there's definitely some breakout moments for that defense. One of the problems for Arizona in the previous year was just we had no defensive line at all. We could not pressure the quarterback. It put a lot of pressure on the secondary and the linebackers to make plays. And, when you're playing teams like USC, you're playing teams that can sling the ball around, it makes it really difficult to stay in games. And we saw that when Arizona went to the Coliseum, like you mentioned. I think the biggest problem was our defense. We scored on that team. This Arizona offense is a top 10 offense in the country, and we're going to score 30 points a game. I'm sure there'll be a couple games where we'll get held under that, but it's really dynamic, and it's whether or not this defense can step forward. The difference between this year and last year, and the reason I think some Arizona fans are quite optimistic about the team, is that we finally have size on the defensive line. You mentioned some freshmen. Kylan Wilborn had a number of sacks. He was an incredible freshman on the line. He's more of that rushing edge kind of guy. But we finally are playing players that are above 260 pounds as defensive tackles. That's like a really big deal. It's the difference between being an okay team and a good team. And then the skill of those big guys is the difference between being a good team and an elite team. I think we're going to be a good team this year. You have players like PJ Johnson, who is a JUCO transfer, came in. He's been playing really well, and in the spring game, he was excellent. He's above 300 pounds. You have Derek Bowles, who's 300 pounds now. You have this defensive tackle who was injured last year, Sione Taufahema, who is above 300 pounds. So you're going to have size finally for the first time since probably 2014. So I think that gives us a little bit more optimism. When you go back, though, we have the 2 freshman All-American linebackers, Colin Schooler and Tony Fields. Those guys are really good, and they have an excellent eye for the ball. Colin Schooler came out of Mission Viejo High School, which is kind of a powerhouse in Southern California, and really teaches fundamentals. And you can just see the way that he and Fields run to the ball, regardless of who has it. They can read the gaps. They have great instincts. And growing as sophomores, I know that they've gained a little bit of weight. They're a little undersized. I think Tony Fields is about as tall as I am. He's definitely a lot bigger, but we're pretty optimistic about that front.
Brian Conger on the line from Wildcat Radio. Please join him right there for Arizona football coverage. We're running down the Wildcats post Pac-12 Media Day on Wednesday. And just checking out these numbers. So if you follow tackle statistics, you will see that there's roughly a handful of guys per conference that rack up 100 total tackles. We got Tony Fields last season at 104, 7.5 tackles for loss, and 5 sacks with a pick. Colin Schooler, a lot of disruption behind the line of scrimmage, 13.5 tackles for loss, 4 sacks and 2 picks for 119 yards and returns, plus a pick 6 and 96 total tackles. So 2 guys basically in that 100 tackle range.
As true freshmen too. I mean, that's pretty impressive.
It is. So if the year 1 to year 2 theory holds out in regards to improvement, then these guys could be vying for all conference selection this year. Derek Bowles, a guy that had 42 stops, and you mentioned Kylan Wilborn with 32 tackles as well, and he got behind the line quite a bit with 7 sacks, as you mentioned, and 9 tackles for loss. We had somebody on the live chat, and you to a certain extent, Bryant, have covered this, but looking for areas of improvement across both sides of the ball. Many, maybe some particular players that could be an impact this year that weren't needed last year.
Well, I think Lorenzo Burns in the secondary is a good example. When you look at Arizona's secondary on paper, it looks like big hat, no cattle. Like, we have some really good players in that secondary that didn't produce last year. I mean, we gave up a ton of yards. Again, you could throw or run on us, and that was kind of a problem. Jace Whitaker, who's the top corner on that team, is excellent, and he's a possible NFL player. I think he's fine on that front. Lorenzo Burns, as a cornerback, had 81 tackles. Like, you don't want your cornerback to have 81 tackles. I'd actually go back and look at the statistics to make sure that that wasn't the number of tackles he had over the course of his career. So he got burned a lot. He gave up a lot of catches. And I think he's a key cog in the secondary. When you have two corners that can play legitimate defense, I think that makes things very difficult, particularly in a pass-heavy Pac-12 conference. So I would look for him to improve. You have a player like Demetrius Flanagan-Fowles in the secondary. He's a safety, very good. There was times where he could be a bit of a space cadet in coverage, but he definitely has the tools. So I think if you have those two guys step up to a next level, I think that really makes our secondary a much more legitimate unit on this team. Shifting over to the offense, it'll be interesting to see on the wide receiving front who steps up. So we have Rich Rodriguez basically recruited about 80 guys that were 5'10", 165 pounds at the wide receiving corps. It was like central casting. They were all the same size. They were all the same height. And that started to change last year. So it'll be interesting to see who steps up. You have a player like Shun Brown, who was kind of playing in the slot a little bit. They had him on the outside sometimes, but he could be a long threat. He's very quick. He's got good hands. And his statistics were fine last year. They weren't overwhelming. He could be a player that could break out. Kind of reminds me of somebody like Mike Thomas. I think Mike Thomas was better, but he was a NFL wide receiver that played for Arizona and was a burner in the Pac-12. I don't think Shun Brown's Mike Thomas, but if he gets to like 60 to 75% of that type of player, where it's a shorter guy on the outside, but he can actually catch the ball and run after he catches it, that could be important. I think the biggest guy to look out for on the offense is Sean Poindexter in the wide receiving corps. This guy's like 6'6". He's a really tall player. If you watch the spring game, he's basically the only player that Khalil Tate was throwing to. I exaggerate a little bit, but he was one of the major targets. It's been interesting. He's trying to put it together, and you're seeing that. And it looks like Tate is really comfortable throwing to him. So it'd be good to have some size on that outside, somebody that can just go up on a ladder and catch the ball. I think two more players to keep a lookout for is our tight ends. Rich Rodriguez was like Lucy in the football with our tight ends for about like 6 years, where he kept saying, oh, we're going to integrate the tight ends and all this stuff. And then he never did. He finally did last year. So you have players like Bryce Wolma and Janie Nunley, who were some of our top pass catchers in the wide receiving corps. And I think tight ends are cheat codes. If you can find guys that are like 6'4", 240 pounds that can catch, I mean, good luck if you're a 5'10", 135, 150 pound linebacker trying to tackle these guys. So I'm really hoping that that Noel Mazzoni integrates the tight ends into this offense. He hasn't in the past. But during these the spring camp and after Pac-12 Media Day, he's been talking up these these tight ends more. So it'll be interesting to see if he actually integrates them, because they're great pass catchers.
Yeah, they really are. It's just a different type of throw for the quarterback in a different situation in which he typically has to be used to the guy looking covered, but it's a safe throw if it's a really good tight end that can box the guy out and make that type of reception. And then if you're talking about the kind of combination that you are, he can also take it down the seam and burn the defense for some big yardage, as some of your tight ends did last year, one in particular at 26.5 yards per reception. Shun Brown, as you mentioned, not dynamic last season, but certainly contributed heavily with 43 catches for 573 and 6 touchdowns. Sean Poindexter, 19 receptions for 294. I'm looking at the tackle numbers, as you alluded to, on the defensive side, right at the top of the list with all these defensive backs. And maybe that needs to change.
That's not a good sign.
You want that one, maybe two safeties that get their nose in there and certainly are run enforcers. But besides that, the linebackers need to clean up the tackles and a little bit along the defensive front. But Lorenzo Burns, as you mentioned, with 85 and did pick off 5 passes as well. Yeah. Jace Whitaker, 46 and 3 picks, and Flanagan Fowler as well, as you mentioned, 81 stops total and 3 interceptions. So interception totals up there as well. You don't see a whole lot of defensive backs nearing the 5 interception total, and you've got 5, 3, and 3 here out of those 3 guys in particular. So another way to play defense to a particular extent is to turn the ball over. Maybe you don't have a dominant defense, but you have a defense that plays well in the red zone. You have a defense that makes the one play to stop a drive. Maybe they're getting chewed back and forth between the tackles. They don't have the girth to really stop the run, but they make the one play in the backfield, or a defensive back makes a couple pass breakups in the secondary, and just you have those couple guys that can make disruptive plays to put an offense behind the chains and turn it into a long drive. And most offenses have difficulty sustaining that. So it's certainly done more so in conferences like the Big 12 would be the classic example, the Pac-12 to a lesser extent, that you can get by with a defense that may be lowly ranked statistically, but they make plays in the red zone and they make plays that turn the ball over and give short fields to the offense. And that's another way to do it.
Oh, absolutely. And you hit the nail on the head. Arizona, our best metrics. So Wildcat Radio on our website, wildcatradio.com, we actually have an econometrician, I think he's a guy that's really good at statistics and math, and he's an econ major and did a lot of math stuff. So he's made his own college football advanced statistical model. It's called Beta Rank, and it's on our website, Wildcat Radio AZ. He actually goes through every single team. So schedule strength, advanced metrics on run defense and pass defense and offense and all that stuff. You should check it out. When he broke down Arizona, it's not homer numbers, by the way, too. Like, he's from Wyoming and he happened to go to Arizona. When you look at our defensive metrics on the advanced front, we were awful at drive efficiency. We gave up so many yards. Teams could just sustain these long and quick drives on Arizona's defense. But it was the turnover rate that really was the game changer in the sense of getting Arizona to a bowl last year. We had a lot of interceptions in the secondary. Our linebackers put a lot of pressure on the quarterback, and that was helpful in terms of being able to generate wins. So I think you hit the nail on the head on that front.
All right, Bryant Conger on the line from Wildcat Radio, joining us to break down the Arizona Wildcats post Pac-12 Media Day last night in Los Angeles. We've got a number of comments on the chat, one involving the entire conference. So we know of the issues that the Pac-12 encountered in postseason play last year with a 1-8 record. I'm trying to think of the win. The win wasn't necessarily that impressive. Yes, Utah defeated West Virginia, depleted West Virginia team minus Will Greer and some other.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because if he played, they would have lost that game. So we could have been 0-9 there.
Yeah, so it was close to the complete whitewash for the Pac-12. This was a conference that just a few years ago, I remember doing my post-2014 analysis where, Brian, I take the results of the Power 5 games between the conferences and I seed the teams so it provides a fair fight type of analysis. You don't have a USC beating up on Purdue and rating that just as it's a win in the Pac-12's column. It's put into a metric as a 1 seed versus, let's say, a 9 seed, so forth and so on. And the Pac-12 at that point, you could look at just the sheer metric of wins and losses going 13-6 against the Power 5, and then break it down by seed and also see that that was a substantial 13-6, not a cupcake compiled 13-6. And here we are 3 to 4 football seasons later, and it just appears as though it's pretty much consensus that this is the worst of the 5 conferences, although I'm not going to concede for sure that it's the worst. I think the Big 12 is still right there. It's still a deep conference in terms of decent teams. Just the elite has been broken down, and the likes of Oregon in particular just not there like they were, and UCLA to a lesser extent down in the last couple of years. So your thoughts about the Pac-12 possibly bouncing back?
I think it's a better conference than it was last year. You have a team like Washington, which returns a ton on defense and offense. And, as much as that quarterback gets flack from other fans in the Pac-12, I think he's quite good. You have an Oregon team that has recruited incredibly well. They have one of the best defensive coordinators in the country. I know people talk about the SEC being known for its defense, but Jim Leavitt is one of the best in the country, probably the best the west of the Mississippi, period. He was retained when Willie Taggart made the jump over to Florida. He was retained by Mario Cristobal and that Oregon defense. So that'll be exciting. You have a player. One of the things that people forget is that Oregon's quarterback was hurt, and Braxton Burmeister was just kind of a mess as a true freshman. And that's fine. I mean, like, Khalil Tate was a mess as a true freshman too. It's really hard to step in that quickly and get used to the speed of the game. So he returns. Justin Herbert is their quarterback. He returns. That offense should be quite good. And one of the dark horses to win the Pac-12 period. You go to Stanford, and Bryce Love is one of the most dynamic running backs in the last 10 years. I mean, that guy averaged almost 10 yards a carry, which is insane. His numbers were incredible. You have Myles Gaskin returning to Washington as a running back there. When you move down to the South, it gets a little bit more tenuous. So let's start with the USC. USC's defense is excellent. It's going to be one of the best in the country. The problem is their offense, their quarterback situation. They might start a high school senior, basically, might have the keys to that offense there. You have a player like Ronald Jones leaving that team, who is one of the best running backs in Pac-12 history. And Stephen Carr comes back, but he was a bit injured. So it'll be interesting to see if that offense can catch up to the defense. If they can, USC, I don't think is going to be a national title contender. The only team in this conference who likely will be Washington. The USC will be quite good if their offense can just kind of be fairly solid this year. And it'll be interesting if they can do that. UCLA is going to be a mess. ASU is going to be a mess. But Chip Kelly injects some enthusiasm for the long term for that team. I think Arizona could be quite good. If their defense gets, again, to that top 80 position, I think that's a team that can win 9 to maybe 10 games, like maybe being like a 5 to 10% chance. But there's some really dynamic players in the Pac-12. It's just interesting to see if those players can gel with their team. So like even at ASU, Manny Wilkins is a great quarterback. He's really good, a good college football quarterback. But, Herm Edwards and some of the personnel they have over there might kind of hinder their opportunity to be good.
Yeah, I was commenting to Tony Siracusa last night in reviewing Pac-12 Media Day that it's rare that you have a team that finished 6-3 in its conference last year, returns its starting quarterback, plays in the weaker of the two divisions. And I had a few other things too. N'Keal Harry, the best player on the team, is back. Mm-hmm. And they're most likely the 75th or 80th best team in the country. They're not expected to do. It's pretty much consensus across the board that Arizona State is going to have a difficult season. When I look at the Pac-12 South Division, I see the worst division in college football. But I only see Colorado as a bad team. I think it's just that it's not top heavy. There are no real standout teams. USC is obviously a bit down, projected to be down this year for the reasons that you cite. I think long term they're fine. They'll be back in it and will probably win the South. They have the best roster. UCLA, I'm curious about just because of Chip Kelly's track record at Oregon. Had a long conversation for anyone that wants to hear about my analysis on Chip Kelly and his challenges at UCLA last night with Tony Siracusa. Mm-hmm. But if you look at the roster that Chip Kelly has to work with in regards to recruiting rankings, it is eerily similar to the teams that he took to top 5 rankings at Oregon, like 2 to 4 ranking in the Pac-12, 15 to 20 ranking in the country year, the entire roster. And that's exactly what he had at Oregon. Different circumstances, different offense, different, same offense, but different maybe effect 5 to 8 to 10 years later that he had. So he's going to have to adjust and become a different type of head coach and show that he's a complete coach. But Colorado, obviously the aberration 2 years ago, and they really showed their true colors late in the season, getting blown out back-to-back weeks. The Pac-12 has some work to do.
Well, one I think I'd mention is Utah. Utah's pretty good, pretty good team this year. They got a great quarterback. They have a solid defense, a good coach. They could win the Pac-12 South if things shift into place for them. That's a team that can win, between 7 and 10 games if they kind of step up. I think the biggest challenge for the Pac-12 South, and you hit it on the head when you talk about Colorado or UCLA or even Utah, which is really bizarre to say, particularly UCLA and Colorado, their trench play can be like that's the problem with UCLA. UCLA has a solid defense, but they were pulling on their offensive line. They were pulling an already weak defensive line. They were picking players off of there to put on their offensive line. And that's like when you break the glass in case of emergency. I fear for this quarterback at UCLA, whoever it is, whether it's Spate or Robinson, or whoever they end up going with, they're going to get destroyed if they don't fix that offensive line quickly. And the defensive line is not very good either. There's like 6 guys, and then that's it on the entire roster that probably can play Division I football right now at this moment. Colorado's the same thing. Their wide receiving core, by the way, is quite good. It'll be interesting to see if Montez. So we write this Pac-12 preview. It's called the completely uncalled for 2018 Pac-12 preview, and we give every team an intro. And in Colorado, it's, are you ready for the full Montez? Because if Montez can be good, that team can at least win 6 games. They won't be terrible. And he has a lot of players to go to on that front. So yeah, I'm with you. It'll be interesting to see what happens in this conference. It's not the strongest, but there are a lot of really good players and opportunities for teams to rise to the occasion. Whether or not they will is remains to be seen.
We've got tons of comments about Arizona football, the Pac-12 by extension, and college football on the live chat. Ryan, I will, it's Ryan Mell on the live chat. Bryant, I will pass along this comment and question concerning Arizona recruiting under Kevin Sumlin.
Yeah.
What can we anticipate being some possible adjustments made by him and just the impact that he will have?
Well, the first and the most important thing is recruiting Texas. It was a state that Rich Rodriguez ignored to his great peril. And we just were not a player in there. The problem with that is that it's going to take some time to get players from Texas to consider Arizona. One of the differences between Rich Rodriguez's staff and Kevin Sumlin's is Kevin Sumlin basically requires all of his coaches to hit the recruiting trail and to focus on that. So in theory, that you should see a bump in the type of players that we're recruiting. I think Rich Rod at some point just kind of gave up and said, all right, we're going to take the 3-star players and not compete as much for some of the top talent. Now, the problem is it's going to take a while to do that. If you look at Arizona's recruiting class right now, it's not that great. We have a pretty solid top 25 quarterback, pro-style quarterback. But when you look at basically all the other players outside of a solid linebacker, we're not seeing the results that one would assume from the staff, but it's early. I mean, it really is. We have about 15 scholarships available. I think what happens this year will reflect on what you can see from this Arizona staff moving forward. So it'll be interesting to see if we end up breaking through on that front. That's a good question, though.
Our guy in the chat, Colton Hawthorne, is a huge Arizona fan, or somewhat delusional in watching the Wildcats. He has you as a playoff contender, and Arizona's offense is the best in the country. It legitimately could be on the offensive front, just because Khalil Tate is that strong of a. I mean, and I should back up. We were top 10 in the country last year when you look at the advanced stats. So I think making that case isn't outworldly, but it's all because of Khalil Tate. If we had another quarterback back there, I think we're top 50. So the talent at the running back is fine. The wide receivers are fine. But when you have a quarterback that averages 8.5 yards every time he runs the ball, I mean, you just have to watch the Colorado game to see what we were able to do, or even the Purdue game where he wasn't just running the ball, he was throwing the ball like 20 yards down the field. It is going to be an excellent offensive and a highly underrated one. Whether or not we're a playoff contender, I would disagree with that. I hope we are, but I think we're a dark horse for the South, and that should be the expectations for this team. So the schedule sits up well for Arizona, considering. So a spoiler alert on my schedule rankings, I've got Arizona with the 66th schedule in the country, meaning the 66th most difficult, or about the 5th easiest among the Power 5. With BYU, won't be a pushover. Yes, the Cougars were awful last year. I would expect that they're going to be better. Not that Arizona might not win this game by 20 points, but I don't mean they're going to walk in there and win 56-3. That game's at home. Houston on the road. Houston has been a difficult task for a number of teams in the Pac-12 in recent years. And Houston has a legitimate top 45 to 50 team in the nation, despite being a group of 5 school. Now, what I think the payoff is here, Bryant, in regards to the Arizona schedule, I was analyzing the scheduling approach of all the Power 5 conferences. The Big 12, very easy. Everybody just plays everyone. But everyone else, there's that rotational system that goes on, and the other conferences have designated rivals. In the Pac-12, of course, looking at, so it's the most fair schedule of the other 4 conferences because there's only 12 teams and they play 9 games. So you only miss 2 opponents. So they have the most like scheduling across the board. And what's interesting to me is that if you take, let's say, the 2 extremes in the South, Utah and Arizona, if you look at the 3 teams that each of them play, the 5 of the 7 teams that they play in the other division. Utah's opponents were 24-12 last year in the Pac-12, and Arizona has a 12-24 slate against those three teams. So I think this might be a schedule to take advantage of. You have no Washington or Stanford, either one of them on the schedule.
Mm-hmm. No, I totally agree with you. And let's make this the last question, because my battery's running a little bit low, and I'd love to continue this in the future. It's very fun. Let me address that. I totally agree with you. Utah could win the Pac-12 South, but they have a nasty schedule. One thing to mention is Utah has those teams at home, some of the top ones. So there is some optimism if you're a fan in Salt Lake City. Arizona has a weak schedule, and we had one last year, and I was just hoping that we would break through. We didn't quite do it. But that is a reason for optimism for Arizona. Ed Oliver could eat Khalil Tate like legitimately on the field and barbecue him, because our offensive line is missing Lake Freak, who is our left tackle that game. So that could be a total mess. But outside that, I do think that this schedule lines up to make us a contender in the South. I really do think that that's the case. Arizona is a 1-4. I think those are the Vegas odds for Arizona. I think that's fair, right? I think we win the conference 1 out of every 4 times in the current setting, just because USC's offense could be brutal. I'm sorry, the Pac-12 South.
Okay.
Thanks for correcting me. Yeah, we're 1-4 to win the Pac-12 South.
I will accept that. I will not accept Arizona as a top 10 offense. I understand the metrics, and I understand the advanced metrics, but it's almost like going back to Oregon playing on the national stage against the likes of Ohio State multiple times, LSU, Auburn, when they ran into teams that were that physical. If Arizona had defenses in front of them like Clemson, Ohio State, Alabama, it would be just a different ball game. It would just be a completely different deal.
Oh, we dropped 40 points on USC. I think that was, that's probably Alabama, the best offense that we faced Clemson, all year.
Auburn, Ohio State, Michigan, those are just different kind of defenses.
Oh, yeah, and I think our offensive line is the weak spot.
That would be the problem
here. So
that's the problem. Lamar Jackson,
I guess that,
over everyone.
I can accept that. Yeah, it'd be interesting.
Lamar Jackson ran everyone around in circles a couple of years ago, and then he faced LSU in a bowl game, and he couldn't score a touchdown.
That's a fair point. Yeah, I think
it's difficult when you can't block those guys, and you've got like 9 NFL defenders on the other side.
When the linebackers are, nobody's as fast as Khalil Tate really, but when the linebackers are 60 to 75% as fast as Khalil Tate, and there's 3 of them chasing him down, and they have the angle, that does make a lot of sense.
Bryant Conger, we want to get your contact information in before we lose you. So Bryant, let people know where you are and what's available.
Yeah, you can follow us at Wildcat Radio AZ. We also have a podcast for Pac-12 fans. It's a 12 Pack Radio. You can follow us on Twitter, 12 Pack Radio. One thing to mention, we did write a 130-page position by position, team by team breakdown of the Pac-12. It's called the Completely Uncalled For Guide to the Pac-12 season. That's on our website, Wildcat Radio AZ, along with advanced statistics that we break down. It's a good alternative to the S&P, and the numbers are quite good. So Wildcat Radio AZ is our website, and we put a lot of work into that Pac-12 preview. It's quite good, so check it out.
I was expecting crickets on the live chat, but we've got hundreds of comments, so thanks for stirring up the discussion here, Bryant. I appreciate it. The daytime live streams don't necessarily do very well, but we've got a number of people on the line, and I'm going to stay right here and answer questions and comments for the next few minutes here on the live chat. Bryant Conger, Wildcat Radio. Bryant, thanks so much for stopping by. Would love to flag you down in the next few weeks to get a update on fall camp.
Oh, absolutely. And any Pac-12 stuff, I'm happy to talk just the conference in general. It'll be a fun one.
Excellent. Bryant, have a great day.
Hey, you too, Mark. Thank you very much.
All right, folks. Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. With comments, of course, suggestions, anything that you've got for me. I'm going to run through the chat. I'm going to answer anything that you've got here. I thought Bryant did a nice job of talking Arizona football and the Pac-12 by extension. I have started my schedule rankings, released at number 70, New Mexico State. And so that's the one fault that I will once say about the schedule rankings that I do have, is that so I've got the Power 5 plus the major independents. Well, if we extend the major independents to the likes of UMass, New Mexico State, Liberty, which they're listed as major independents, but they certainly do not play in the same league as many of the group of five teams, many of the group of five conferences. So there's a gap there. So certainly Memphis and Houston and Boise State play at a much higher level. They play tougher schedules, but I am not ranking them because that would take on a whole completely different metric of measuring the group of five against each other and then the group of five schedules against the Power Five. So I'm just going with the Power Five and the major independents. And this year I've included New Mexico State, Army, of course, as I've included them in previous years. And it wasn't difficult to start at the bottom and analyze that schedule of the New Mexico State versus Liberty and a few other teams that are right there at the bottom. And then, of course, it becomes complex from there. All right, then we'll do previews and predictions, and hopefully I can make it to the wire and get in every Power 5 team with my preview and prediction. I'm hoping that that will be the case. All right, what do we got here? Prince. Who has a better defense, Arizona or the School of the Deaf and the Blind? Deaf and the Blind. Well, they say that the other senses are elevated when you lose the other senses. So I think that's a fair point. Prince, what happened the last two times Clemson and Ohio State met? Well, the last two were 31-0. Where the Ohio State defense played pretty well against the Clemson offense, but the Ohio State offense was deplorable and the Clemson defense dominant that went on to win the national championship. And I would say that if they played 10 times, Clemson wins 7 or 8 times, they were the superior team significantly, but not 31-0. Obviously, Clemson couldn't beat teams in their own conference on a regular basis 31-0. So it was an aberration in terms of the score. It was the result of the game. But if you look at across the board, Clemson's schedule, they weren't beating teams like North Carolina, or they lost to Pitt that year. So they win most of those games against Ohio State by a touchdown to 10 points. And Ohio State wins a couple out of 10 times, but clearly Clemson the better team there. The Orange Bowl in 2013 was a toss-up, and basically Corey Brown fumbled a ball, Philly Brown on a punt return with Ohio State with a 9-point lead. Otherwise, it's a different game. Braxton Miller throws a pick late. Clemson wins the game, but that was a toss-up. That was a 39-35, 41-39, whatever the score was, something in that range. But you guys talking Ohio State and Clemson for some reason. Prince, what Ohio State game were we talking about? Bad luck. I never said anything about bad luck. No bad luck. I don't remember any bad luck. Just Clemson was better. Clemson was significantly better, miles better in 2016. That night, overall, they were somewhat better. They had the best quarterback in the country, and Ohio State had the 25th or 30th best quarterback in the country. That was a huge difference. And Ohio State's offensive line was not prepared, especially once they had the left tackle knocked out the first or second play of the game, was not prepared for that defensive front from Clemson. Those were the two big differences in those two teams. The 2013 game was, those teams were very comparable. Right. Arizona doesn't matter. Iron Cross. Everyone matters here at Mark Rogers TV. We cover everyone. And we're talking Ohio State for some reason. Arizona's defense filled with freshmen last year. We pointed that out. The secondary leading the team in tackles, all those defensive backs. All right. Mark, but when those upper echelon defenses you mentioned play quality offenses, the offenses tended to score. Okay. Give me some examples and we will go from there. Yes, I'm not saying that a quality offense is not going to score some points. I'm not saying that Alabama's not going to give up some points to a quality offense, but I will take the defensive team with the NFL linemen and really NFL players across the board. I will take that. I will run through history, recent college football history, and I will take the blue bloods that line up the NFL players along the lines in particular against the Oregons and Arizonas and Oklahoma States and all those schools. and the Texas Techs and the Washington States. I will take that matchup any day of the week. And I will for every game that you show me that somebody broke through on a bunch of NFL players on defense, I will show you 10 games in which the NFL team, the future NFL team, and you know what I'm talking about. I'm talking about Clemson and Ohio State and Florida State and Alabama, when they are loaded with NFL players, that team wins 9 of 10 times. Colton has Arizona as a contender because of the schedule being easy, as we just mentioned. No Washington, no Stanford. If you're one of the Pac-12 South Division teams and you don't have to play the 2 best teams in the conference, that is a huge advantage. We know that USC has to play Stanford. They miss Washington. There's other teams in that division, i.e. UCLA, that has the most difficult schedule in the Pac-12 that has to play both Washington and Stanford. And most likely the 3rd best team, Oregon. That's what Chip Kelly faces this year. Clemson's hardest game might be at Texas A&M, so they are nearly a given for the playoffs. And it's a good point. Number 1 ND fan. Clemson only had 6 scholarship seniors last year and lost to no one. Sorry, but Clemson will be even better this year and make a 4th straight college football playoff. Well, I will release my predictions soon. What are your thoughts on the Big Ten? From Clemson alum 98. All right. The O-line doesn't make the team. Louisville isn't doing anything. Don't know that there's anything in here. We had the one comment that I responded to in the live chat concerning South Carolina defeating Michigan. That because the comparison was made between the SEC Western Division and the Big Ten Eastern Division. I will stand by this. The SEC West is better top to bottom. From 1 through 7, the SEC Western Division doesn't have any horrible teams. Arkansas is close. Ole Miss isn't very good, but the other 5 teams are really good. And Alabama might be great, and Auburn has a chance to make the playoff. And LSU is loaded with talent. It may not show up against that schedule. Mississippi State's one of the 15 or 18 best teams in the country. There's a lot of depth in the SEC Western Division, and there's nobody that's deplorable. When your 6th best team is Ole Miss, you're pretty good. The Big Ten Eastern Division, the top 4 are better than the SEC Western Division. Ohio State, Michigan, Michigan State, Penn State. Better than the top 4, where you have to dive into the Texas A&M, Mississippi State, LSU range for that 3rd and 4th slot. But Indiana, Maryland, Rutgers. Rutgers, awful. Maryland, close to awful. Indiana, pretty bad. They've regressed, although they played pretty decent against some quality competition last year. Ohio State, Michigan, Michigan State. So I'll take the SEC Western Division top to bottom. I'll take the Big Ten East 1 through 4. All right, folks, schedule rankings coming along with previews and predictions. But first, schedule rankings. They will take some time. Oregon State is worse than Rutgers. Nobody's worse than Rutgers. All right, good to hear from you guys. Please continue to support the channel as we bring what we believe is the best quality in college football discussion and debate and analysis. Not a whole lot from contributors and guests coming up in the next couple of weeks. I want fall camp to set in. That will allow me to focus on bringing you other content, and then we'll get some news out of fall camp and bring back a lot of good guests to break down some team reports as we get near that halfway mark through August to get you set for the season. We are 5 weeks away from tonight, 5 weeks from tonight, in particular, Purdue and Northwestern, 5 weeks and 2 days away from the first college football Saturday. Appreciate your support, your help as we've pushed past 5,000 subscribers just a few days ago, on to 10,000 and beyond. We will see you guys soon right here at Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football.